Yeah, so no bell ringer, just a chicken. Okay, so guys, when we're talking early Cold War, we're usually talking like 1950s, 1960s. And so when we do the late Cold War, that's going to be in the 1970s and 1980s. Okay, right before the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Okay. And so, yeah, there's some stuff that we need to definitely cover because it's definitely, this is something, it's a really short unit, but this unit usually gets a couple questions on a STAR test, especially some of the big things in this, the lecture that we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I just realized you have caption.
Yeah, it's this weird thing that PowerPoint does. Yeah, but no, my subtitles. Okay, so guys, the first thing about the 1950s is that it's this huge, unprecedented kind of rise in the economy.
Is it this one? This one?
Say like in the 1950s?
Let me see. I'm seeing it on
Yeah, right under checking.
there.
And so it's kind of similar to what happens in World War I, right? So in World War I, our economy gets going. Okay, after World War I, the economy's been roaring. We're going really prosperous. We got those roaring 20s and the 1950s. It's very similar. Okay, especially because we're even a stronger economy now. Okay, and then on top of that, we are really the only country, only major country, yeah, I should say, that comes out of the war pretty much unscathed. We do, unfortunately, lose 400,000 plus American lives in the fighting of World War II, but our country, the actual land, isn't really touched by the enemy. Okay, there is some bombing from the Japanese that takes place in California, but for the most part, America itself is fine. Okay, Europe, on the other hand, is not fine. And so we talked about, or y'all read about on, I think it was Wednesday last week, okay, about the Marshall Plan. So we're giving money to Europe, basically as a loan that they are paying back to us. And so America is going great. Okay, and for really the first time in our history, okay, the large portion of the population actually has money to spend. Okay, so we start seeing this rise of what we call consumerism. Okay, this idea that you got to constantly buy things. And so this is really the era of advertisements. Okay, this is where we start seeing big companies like Ford and Pepsi, Coca-Cola. They start really kind of coming into their own and being the kind of big powerhouses that we know of. Okay, and so by the end of the 1950s, 87% of all U.S. families owned a television. Okay, that was something that was really only reserved for the super, super wealthy. Okay, by the 1950s, 75% owned cars. And then by 1960, the biggest buyer of luxury goods is not the wealthy, but it's blue-collar workers who wanted a taste of the better life.
Oh,
Yeah.
so like while you're talking, you understand what you're saying?
Yeah.
Why is it not working?
Huh?
Why is it not working?
I don't know if you're close enough to not to be there. So by the end of the 1950s, okay, 75% of all U.S. families owned a car. Okay, and so what we were seeing is that there were just way too many people on the road. Okay, before the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, okay, roads were very unsafe. Okay, usually unpaved, so you were going down dirt or gravel roads. Okay, they weren't very well planned, and so there were really big traffic jams. It didn't really allow you to move very quickly. There were also a lot of people that knew that cars were going to break down, and they took advantage of people as they moved across the country. Okay, so it was, while cars are going up in usage, the roads are deteriorating. And so in 1956, okay, President Eisenhower is going to sign this bill into action. Okay, and this is even today the largest public work program that we have ever accomplished in our country. Okay, so 41,000 miles of highway are going to be built connecting the entire country. So we have this for 3 reasons, okay, right? We have those unsafe and inefficient roads. We got to get rid of the traffic jams. But the other reason why Eisenhower wanted these roads was he wanted a quick way to evacuate the major cities in case of a nuclear attack. You remember that this is Cold War, right? And so the whole kind of idea of this is the fear that any single day, any single hour, something could break down between the relations of the Soviet Union and the United States, and there could be a nuclear attack. And so Eisenhower wants a way to get people out of places like New York City or Chicago, okay, or Detroit. And so this is going to make it a lot easier to move across the country. A lot easier. And so we have our major highways right here. And so when I'm talking interstate, okay, I'm talking about any, like if you're on the highway and you hear like I-35, okay, or I-20, okay, those are interstate highways. Those are basically kind of federally built highways. So I said also by the end of the 1950s, okay, 90% of families owned one television. And they were very bulky, usually not the best, but television technology increases really quickly. Okay, I don't know if y'all are old enough to remember, but even like back in the day, like when I was growing up, the TVs are pretty massive.
Yeah.
Now they're much better. Like
Yeah.
this is way
Okay, so when I was like 5, I had this massive TV that was like this big, and it was like really like bulky.
Oh,
heavy,
God.
right, and then it had the, and then what we're seeing right now
Like,
is
I lived on like the 2nd floor of my apartment, so it took like 5 guys just to like drag it up there.
yeah, and so television technology has increased a lot, and television is going to really quickly become the major source of entertainment and news for the American family. It's going to be kind of more of a tradition, and we see it today, right? That televisions are generally where the furniture is pointed to. It used to be the radio. Now, the big thing with this is that there weren't a lot of channels. Okay, as technology's gotten better, you've added a lot more channels, and that's a bigger thing. Okay? But in the beginning, there weren't a lot, and so we really just have the big TV networks like ABC or NBC or CBS trying to basically kind of fight each other to dominate the television screens of everyday American families. And so the programs that we see in the 1950s, since there's not a lot of channels and there's not a lot of shows, okay, the idea was you were going to create a show that was going to appeal to everybody in the family. Okay, because there's not a lot of things to choose from, so you want to make sure it's appealing to the biggest audience possible. And so you wanted something for the dad, you wanted something for the mom, you wanted something for the kids. That way the whole family wanted to watch your show. The problem with this, okay, is that these television shows are going to start really promoting an idealized particular vision of what the American family should look like. Okay, we're going to talk about more about that too. Another big cultural thing is that rock and roll starts emerging in the 1950s. Okay, and it becomes its own genre after World War II. Rock and roll was originally performed by black artists. Okay, the big kind of first people were Fats Domino and Chuck Berry, who's up here. And it was this really interesting mix of a lot of different African American styles. But in the 1950s, you get this young man by the name of Elvis Presley, who is going to adapt rock and roll, and Elvis Presley is going to make it a lot more mainstream, and he's going to spread rock and roll to the white audiences, which makes it a huge hit. And rock and roll gets a major backlash, mainly because of the fact that it originated in the black community. It's kind of what we see with jazz in the 1920s. Okay, jazz, when it comes out, was seen very much like rock and roll was. Okay, rock and roll was seen as promoting this kind of gross, vulgar, lifestyle that parents did not want their teenagers kind of indulging in. And so Elvis Presley with like his hip movements was very kind of suggestive, and parents did not like that. So Elvis Presley faced a lot of backlash for what he was doing. The songs that he wrote were directed at teenagers. This is really the first time in American history that we have a music form that is directly kind of focused not at adults, but at teenagers. It's this emergence of a teenage kind of adolescent culture, which we have seen kind of continue. Every single generation kind of finds an issue with the next generation's music or ways of entertainment. You can kind of think if your parents don't really understand TikTok or something like that.
Those birds are loud.
They're very loud. Okay, so the economy's roaring, we got money in our pockets, we're ready to start spending on stuff. But the problem with the economy is that it's going really well, but you also have to remember about how many millions of men had signed up for the war. And so those millions of men were overseas. They were not back home working. And then the war ends and they come back home and there's no jobs for them. Okay? And so we have this major crisis on our hands. Okay? How are we going to welcome back these soldiers that the public has been saying they are heroes? Okay? Are we just going to throw them back on the street? Are we going to let them fend for themselves? And unfortunately, that's kind of what happens in World War I. Okay? Those World War I soldiers come back home, they don't have jobs, and they don't get a lot of support from the government. Okay? Which is one of the reasons for the Great Depression. Right? The soldiers come back home, they're unemployed, and they're not really able to contribute to the economy. Okay, so FDR wanted to actually do better. And so before FDR died, okay, he signed the GI Bill. And you might have heard of this before, or you might have actually been affected by this before. I am. Okay, my grandfather received money from the GI Bill. Okay, and so what the GI Bill did was they gave basically tuition loans and regular loans to soldiers who had served honorably and were honorably discharged. Okay? And so what this did in the long term, okay, is it led to a major increase in education levels in the United States. It opened the door to a lot of like middle class, working class families who going to university was not going to be an option. Okay? And it still is one of the kind of big kind of pushes for a lot of people going into the military today, is getting access to this GI Bill, and then after giving their service, they're able to go to college, or they're able to get loans after college. That's a big deal. The short-term effect of this is that it took those millions of men, and instead of putting them in the workforce, it put them in college. And so it gave the economy a little bit of time to kind of catch up to this big influx of soldiers coming back home. Okay, but we've got money and food in people's pockets. Soldiers are coming back home. They're coming home back to their loved ones. And those two things, this is kind of the simple version, but those two things end up making lots and lots of babies. Okay, you have to remember we lost a lot of soldiers. Those soldiers come back home. They're excited to see their loved ones. They actually have money to support their families now. And so we see the largest increase in population in American history. From 1950 to 1964, we had the baby boom, or the boomer years. So people born between 1946 and 1964 are what we refer to as the boomers. Okay? So OK Boomer is referring to those people. Yep.
Are you moving?
You got just on Friday. It's gonna be like that.
About this?
And what we did last week. Yeah. And so, baby boom. Okay, we're gonna talk more about when we get into the late Cold War stuff. But this is going to have a major implication for our country. And we're going to talk a lot about how the baby boomers have a big kind of impact on the Social Security program. Because remember, and this is what you need to kind of keep locked in the back of your head, is that we're going to have this generation of a lot of people in a short amount of time, and those people are beginning to retire today. So like my mom was a little older when she had me, but my mom was born in 1959, my dad was born in 1961. So both of my parents are just now starting to kind of talk about retirement, and when they retire, they are going to be, now they're teachers, so it's a little bit different, but they would be able to access Social Security funds. So that's another 2 people on that program. So we'll talk about that moving on. All right, so we got money, we got babies, we got nowhere to put them. Okay, so by the 1950s, most of those veterans coming back home were out of school, they were probably married, and they probably started having kids. And the problem is now they're all in those major cities, and they're cramped into those apartments, and they want to get out, and they want to have a home for their families. But the problem in the 1950s is that there's not a lot of houses. Before Leviton, or before William Levitt, the general home builder built about 2 or 3 homes, maybe a month. Right? What William Levitt or Bill Levitt does is he takes Henry Ford's assembly line and he applies it to the house construction industry. So what he did is he identified 27 steps in building a home. And then in his business, he assigned his builders one of those steps. So he had tile people, he had framing people, he had roof people, he had painting people. Okay, and so by doing that, he was able to produce about like 30 homes a week. And so what we get is Levitt decides to build this massive complex right outside of New York City, which becomes the first Levittown. Okay? And what Levittowns looked like was this up here, so this very organized, planned out community. And what we start seeing in the 1950s is this massive movement to living in the suburbs and not living in the cities. And so this is kind of what you like think of, like you got those rows of houses, they all look identical. Okay, because he's trying to build these homes as fast as possible. So there's not a lot of uniqueness to them. They all look the same. They've got these beautiful manicured green grass lawns. They've got the white picket fence. Okay. And so we start seeing the creation of what we call suburbia, or this culture of living in the suburbs and outside of the town. Okay. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but effects of the suburbs. One is we start seeing cars become a lot more not only popular, but necessary, because these people are living outside of the city, but they're going into the city to work. And it allows people to be farther away from the city. Kind of like how trains worked as well. Okay? The other thing too is we start seeing this phenomenon of what we call white flight. So generally white citizens of cities start leaving in massive droves to these suburbs because they can afford these new houses. And so we start seeing this makeup of cities racially start changing from majority white to majority minorities. And we're going to talk more about white flight later on. And then the other thing too is that Levittowns were very, very well known for widespread discrimination. And there were some times where home buyers had to sign in their agreement that they would not sell it to someone that was non-white. Okay? And so we start seeing, even if that was not in the contract, the discrimination was widespread, that people who tried to buy homes in these communities, which faced a lot of backlash from their white neighbors. And so we started seeing the suburbs become overwhelmingly white. And then the other thing too, okay, is we start seeing women's roles a little bit of a reversal. I want to say that it's a huge reversal because it's not like we have complete freedom for women by World War II, but we saw a little bit of a better situation for women, okay, before World War II. Okay, in the 1920s, they gained the right to vote. Okay, we see the flappers. They start really kind of fighting for women's liberation, women's rights. It's still a major thing for a woman to be the mother and major housekeeper. Okay, but there's some improvement. And then in World War II, we see unparalleled levels of women working in the workplace. But after World War II ends and all those men come back, okay, they are kicked out of their jobs for the most part, or kind of pressured into leaving. And then in the Cold War, we see more of a focus on women's main focus should be on marriage and childbearing, because that, for a lot of people, was believed to be the biggest kind of defense against communism. If you had a strong family with a strong mother who was making sure her children were being raised right, we could avoid communism coming into the country. And so we get the creation of this term nuclear family. And it's not actually referencing like an atomic bomb. It's just talking about like the nucleus of the family being a mother, a father, and how many kids they had in one household. And that's going to be a big focus in the 1950s. But women didn't just kind of meekly go over and back to housekeeping and back into the home. A lot of women really struggled being forced out of their jobs and being put back into this role. And so what we're going to see too in the 1960s and 1970s, our women are going to start fighting back for their rights. And then last one, yes. So 1950s, this major period. It's got a lot of paranoia, a lot of fear about communism. But for the most part, it's a pretty good life. Okay, you got money to spend. Teenagers have the most leisure time of all time. Hey, we got cars, we got televisions, movies are being produced. We can go on vacations now because there's a 40-hour work week. But the problem is that we start seeing, I mean, we've always kind of had two Americas, but we really start seeing two Americas start forming. Okay, and start becoming a lot more kind of publicly known. Because all across the country, we start seeing massive discrimination start happening. And a lot of those benefits of the 1950s are not extended to minorities. And so we had 12 million African Americans serve in World War II. They come back and they are met with the same discrimination, the same Jim Crow laws as before, even though they did the same service as their white counterparts. They are faced with the same discrimination that they had before. Okay? And so a lot of African Americans, even though the GI Bill was open to all veterans, we start seeing that the GI Bill is going to be a lot more difficult for African Americans to get access to, okay, than white soldiers or white veterans. And so in 1947, okay, 60% of black families were living below the poverty line. This gets a little bit better. By 1967, it was about 23%. Okay, but it's far, far higher than white families. And then voting rights. Okay, the thing we see a lot in World War II propaganda that they were fighting for freedom, we're fighting for American values, we're fighting for liberty and everything that we hold dear. And one of the biggest privileges of being an American citizen is the right to vote. But we see massive voter discrimination in the 1950s. And fewer than 10% of the African American population in the Deep South, so I'm talking like Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, voted. And what we start seeing is this major shift, okay, we'll talk more about this too, okay, of African Americans who originally voted for the Republican Party, and we start seeing them shift to the Democratic Party after World War II. Okay. So, early Cold War is a really short unit, but our next unit's a little bit longer. And so what we see is that because of the fact that African Americans served in huge numbers in World War II, and they risked their lives on the basis that they are trying to protect the same values that white soldiers are, and then when they come back, they are not given those same rights. And the fact that in the 1950s, we have this major area of prosperity that they are not able to access, okay, that is going to set up our next kind of phase in our history where we go into the civil rights movement. Okay, and where these minorities are going to start fighting back and trying to get America to own up to what it's trying to say it is. Okay? All right. Guys, we got 15 minutes.